Hello everyone. Thank you for joining Closing Monthly Webinar. I'm Varsha Kotru, Marketing Manager at Kloves. Thank you for joining. Today we'll be discussing scripting best practices on ServiceNow. So the agenda which we are going to follow would be housekeeping. Then we'll have talk about something about Kloves, then followed by scripting best practices webinar and the Q&A section. About housekeeping, I'd like to mention that this webinar will be recorded and you'll be able to access it later. For Q&A process, you are on mute. If you have any questions, please use Q&A section in your Zoom panel and ask the questions you want to ask. If you have any other questions which are not related to this webinar, please feel free to email us at sales@closing.com. You can also access other webinars on our YouTube channel. You can also get other updates for Kloves Inc on our social media and follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn. Then about Kloves. We are a ServiceNow partner since 2011. We are based out of Santa Clara, that is very close to ServiceNow headquarters. We are a full service ServiceNow shop with 250 plus customers as well as 400 plus implementations. We are delivering excellent customer and user experience. We basically deal in HR, CSM, ITSM experts. We provide end-to-end solutions and our focus has been customer service management. Our panelist for today is Mr. Sagar Agarwal. He's a ServiceNow developer at Closing. Welcome, Sagar, in our monthly webinar. You can proceed from there and start your presentation.
Thanks, Varsha. Hello, everyone. This is Sagar. I'm working with Kloves as a ServiceNow developer. I have around 7 years of industry experience, and in my free time, I like to build web apps, play chess, and read books. So, why do we need best practices? First, when we start writing a code or we start building functionalities, we have different players among our teams. We have multiple developers and they came from different background. Say all of them have different ways of writing a code. So once you start implementing best practices across your team, you have a better understanding about your code. So each and every member who looks at the code base knows exactly what's written and why it's written. It's easier to maintain and update your code base in that way, so that once your developer are able to go through the code and understand easily, they can easily make changes to it and update it according to your requirements. There would be less issues and bugs because everyone knows how things are written. So it's hard to create any new bugs or introduce bugs when they know what are the standards and the guidelines that are followed within your organization to write a piece of code. Then there is less impact on instance performance, because with these best practices you bring in some ways of writing a code which impacts or has less performance impact on your instance, and hence improving your efficiency and load time of your forms and other things on your instance. Then reduces your rework. So when you're developing something, it's really important that when you write a piece of code, you should not be rewriting again and again, because there are either bugs or maybe the code has already been written, but since there is no standard way, your developers are rewriting the same piece of code again and again to do something in a different way. Then the last, there would be no surprises in your production instance. Why? Because you had a certain standard in your place where each and every person know how to write things, and so there would be no surprises. So moving on, one of the first best practices to understand how to write a code and the importance of indentation or formatting within your code. So this example shows that you can write a code. It would be a simple piece of code, but can be confusing if you don't indent it properly. By indentation, I means the tabs. If you can see the code at line 4 5, there are tab form of code. So once you start indenting your code, it's really easy and clean to understand what are the different blocks of code, what is the functionality that's happening within the piece of code. So you can easily see the difference between unintended code and intended code. And in ServiceNow itself provides a tooling mechanism within their scripting field to indent your code automatically so that you are free from the hassle to indenting it manually. So within the multiple tools over your scripting space, you have a button which is highlighted in yellow in this slide. So once you click it, your code is automatically indented. Second, lack of white space. So once you start writing a code, sometimes you just keep on writing a code without adding any space between your code, which makes really redundant and inefficient while reading the code, and it would be really hard to understand that how is one piece of code different from another. So by adding a meaningful space between pieces of code really differentiates them between one another so that you can easily understand that yes, this piece of code works on this particular functionality, and your developer would have a really easy time to understand the code. Then you can see the comparison between these two pieces of code which have meaningful white space and without the white space. So it would be really easier. Though ServiceNow don't provide any tooling to add this white space automatically, but as a developer, you have to understand how you can introduce this space for your meaningful context of the code. Then there can be a scenario where you can introduce too much white space. So as no space is a bad thing, too much white space is also a bad thing. Once you start adding too much white space within the code, you really diminish the difference between where your code started, where your code ended, whether it's either it's a different block of code or whether it's the same block of code. So there is a fine line between how much space to add, and once you start implementing this best practices little by little, your developers would understand that yes, there's the meaningful space that we can add to our code without impacting the performance or meaning of the code. Then you can see the difference how the first piece of code with lot of white space is different from a piece of code which has a meaningful and subtle white space in between different blocks of code. Then skipping declaration. So when you write code, usually what we are doing is to handle the variable values, we declare variables. So in a line one of code in here, you can see that var state. So we are declaring a state variable with var. On the second line, you can see that category doesn't have anything like var in front of it. So it's skipping declaration. We haven't declared category. The impact is when it comes to ES6, ECMAScript 5 of JavaScript, when you don't declare a variable, it is declared on your global scope, which can really impact the overall functionality of a code. So always and always make a best practice that whenever you are writing a variable, you should declare it. Although ServiceNow has already started from last few releases adding a iffy code to avoid this, but yes, there can be places where if you don't add variable or don't add declaration, it can impact your code. Then the solution, simply declare your variables. Then bad naming convention. So when you declare a variable, as you can see on first code script, uh, your whatever value your variable contains, your variable name should signify it. So if you see at the first piece of code, it's mgr1, mgr2. So if someone looks at 200 lines of code, it's really easy to get lost in what's the difference between mgr or mgr2. What's the meaning of e1? What does e1 contain? So if you look at same code in second piece of script, where we have uh, a simple naming convention which signifies that what value it contains, you can easily identify that yes, caller manager variable contains caller's manager object. Then caller manager email contains email address of caller's manager, and same goes for other things. So whenever you are writing a variable, make it easy for others also to read your code. Then same goes for the function names too. Although there are not many places where you are going to define the function names, but whenever there is an opportunity, it's a good practice that you define a meaningful function name, that what it does. So in a first piece of code, I have picked it from one of my clients, which was running this in a live. I don't know who wrote this, but he was a lazy person as a developer, because this code is one of the examples that ServiceNow has provided in their documentation site. And hello world callback is one of the function names. So if you have multiple scripts that running same or has same function name, there can be chances where they collide and functionality may break. So uh, if you look at the second piece of code, I have set it as set user email. So this function name simply suggests that what its actually purpose is, and the underscore cv simply identify that it's a callback function name. One of the naming conventions also identifies the life cycle. So if you are naming a variable which is going to be used in maybe just two lines of code, then you can go for a shorter name. But if it's going to be used maybe like in 50 or 100 lines of code, then it would be a good practice to make it as detailed as possible, but not going over the board. Then comments. I've seen a lot of places where usually developer starts writing code, and they do write long code, a good quality code, but they don't add any comments. They don't add any information for other developers who may come back to this code later on. Maybe I wrote this code and I came back to this code 3 months down the line, and I won't be able to understand that what's happening. So there would be a lot of time that would be wasted just to understand what's written in the code. So it's good to add meaningful comments. Like in this piece of code, once I simply started writing that what does the sys id of that I have added in the code means, so I don't have to go copy this sys id, go back to my groups table in ServiceNow and search and filter the name of the group to just to know that yes, this sys id belongs to this group name. So it really helps your developers, your team, to improve their workflow of writing code and avoid any loss of developer hours just because you have to go through the code again and again. Then again, as we did for too much white space, too many comments is also a bad thing. Although it's not going to impact your performance of instance, maybe a little, but not that much. It won't be significant. But um, as we have already implemented a best practice where your variable name should identify themselves that what they have. So if you're adding a comment, it should add some value to your code instead of just adding the comment for the sake. So your comment should be meaningful and it should not be readable. If you're adding some comment like more than 3-4 words, then it should be really necessary that what you are adding. It should not be, you should not be adding some comments that are self-explanatory, like category should is hardware. No. Then you can see the comparison where we have just added a meaningful comment for a piece of code and a place where we have just gone overboard with the comments. Then these are some of the best practices that are used in IT industry as a whole, which you can adopt in terms of comparison and adding comments. Then if you look at the code, you can see that there is some stars and comments added. So it's one of the things that usually where full-fledged code editing and repositories are there, where when you define a function name, you add some parameters, that what are the parameters that we are passing along with the data types that there would be, along with it the return value. So let's say if you are writing a script include and it has a long function, so at the end or maybe at the beginning your developer can just get confused that what actually I am returning. And even though if you know what you are returning, what would be the data type, so that can impact your code or functionality if you don't know these things, and it can really help your developer. Then the next would be the zombie code. So let's say someone started writing some code and there was some bug. So as a developer, sometimes you add alerts just to understand that what's the value that we have right now. So once a purpose is solved, instead of just removing that piece of code, we simply comment that out. That's called a zombie code. So later on, if I come back, I don't understand that why this code is there. Do we need this? Should we be using this? Or on a simpler terms, let's say by mistake, I simply uncommented this code. So it's now a live code. So it can create bugs. You can introduce bugs due to these zombie codes. Solution, it's a very simple thing. If there is something that is not needed in your code or in your functionality, remove it instead of adding comment. Or if it's necessary to comment it, then write a note so that someone who come back to this code to maybe add it or maybe add some functionality or feature knows that why this code is commented. In comparison, so you can see that how much your code is cleaner and easier to understand if you are not adding any redundant code within your scripts. Then empty statements. So in the same way as we discussed earlier, sometimes let's say if you're writing if else condition, so in the else condition we added some logs or maybe there was some functionality and later on we don't need it. So instead of removing the entire else statement, uh, we just comment the code or we remove the code from there. So there are blank statements or blank conditions within your code, which really confuses the developer that maybe your developer came to that particular code to fix some bug, and because of the blank condition he thinks that yes, maybe this is the reason why there is this bug. So if you are removing the code, be diligent about it. Remove it from the places, remove the additional code that's not required after you remove the relevant code. Then error handling. So when we write code, it's very prone, it's very easy and natural to have some bugs. So what I think about the bugs is uh, when you write a code or when you write some function or feature, think about that one user who tries to break your code, or think about the edge cases that maybe your requirements doesn't address, and start building your code base based on that. And one of those cases is null cases. So there's a easy way to get values is dot walking within scripts. And if you don't have a value for a field, reference field, and you are pointing to some other field on that reference record, it's called dot walking. And if that reference field is missing, then you have a null case which introduce your bugs. So let's say you build a feature and that feature has 100 reference record, and for just one edge case there would be no reference record. So your edge case is going to break in your production code production because you didn't test it for it. So think about how you are going to build your functionality. Consider the edge cases even though they are not mentioned in the requirements. Then try catch. So sometimes you have writing the code, but you cannot identify all the edge cases. So in that case, you can use try catch functionality from JavaScript, in which you write your code within the try block. And if there is an error, then that particular block of code would not run, but rest of your code would work perfectly fine. So, and you can in the catch block, you can add those errors as a log messages within your logs, system logs. Then user interactions. Usually what I've seen is when it comes to user interactions, we usually being lazy add simply alert messages, which is really bad UI in terms of user interaction and user experience. So ServiceNow provides really good feature in terms of user interactions. So try to avoid those alerts and confirm messages. It's just being lazy. On the client side, we have info messages, which provide blue and red messages at the top of the form. Then we have field messages, where we define different messages at the specific field so that it's easier for user to understand that this particular message is for this particular field. While for the server, we have same info messages and field messages. So just try to avoid those alerts. It's not a really good experience. Plus, if you want to show some kind of pop-up to user, you want to have some kind of interaction with user dynamically, we have windows and glide windows and models. So you can use that if you want that kind of interaction from user. Then synchronous and asynchronous. It's a really debatable topic that which is better in which scenario. Synchronous simply means that once you start executing your code, until and unless one statement, execution of one statement is complete, your code won't move on the next level. In the normal scenario, you have seen that once a user performs an interaction, if your code is working on some functionality, your user won't be able to do anything until unless that particular functionality or operation is completed. So that's synchronous on a high level. So some examples would be for server side on before, on after, or maybe you are calling a script include. While on the client side, it would be get reference without a callback function, or glide ajax functionality with get XML wait. Then any kind of a server call from client side, which doesn't have a callback function. So on the right, you can see a code example where we are trying to get some information related to user with get XML wait. So it's going to run synchronously, and until and unless you get this data from server, your user won't be able to do anything on your form. There are some edge cases where it's better to use synchronous in terms of against asynchronous, like on submit client script. So you can't run them asynchronous, because if you try to do some validation on submit, uh, by the time your results are received from the server side, your record has been already submitted. So your validation got skipped. So there are both the cases where you should be using synchronous and where you should not be, but majorly you should not be. Then asynchronous. Asynchronous would be the on the other side of a synchronous, where You start performing a action when you start executing a statement, and because it's asynchronous, your second statement starts get executing, and once you receive a response from your first statement, your action is performed. So on a high level, simply that your user is not blocked because some functionality is running at the back end, so they can perform whatever they want to do without any blockage. There are functionality available on server side and client side too for asynchronous, like async business tool, calling script include through asynchronous approach, then executing asynchronous script through events. And for client side, we have get reference with a callback, get XML, get X answer, then any kind of a server call with a callback function. On the right side, you can see when we called a glide edx method, we used get XML answer. So there are two things related to get XML or glide edx. There are get XML and get XML answer. It would be easier to use get XML instead of get XML answer should be used, because for get XML you have to write a specific code where you get your response for your answer from a response element. So use get XML answer, and as you can see that I have defined the callback function as cv underscore get user location. So this comes from the best practice where we define how function name should be written. Then we have debugging. So as a developer, when you write code, there would be bugs, and it is really helpful when you have some really good debugging options, and ServiceNow do provide those. So on the server side, we have debugger. If you look at your scripting field on the above option where there's a bug icon, if you click on that, you would have a Chrome developer types of UI where you can see your you can add breakpoints to your code, and once you recreate the scenario and run your script, your code would be paused at the breakpoint that you have added, and you get all the information like what's the current state of your code, what has all the variables have what values. So it's really easy to use this tool and really powerful. Then you can the debuggers by going to session debug and enable all. And once you reload the form, you will start seeing all the debug logs within the form. So you can go through each and every of the logs. It's a bit messy, but it's a really good option if you start looking at that. Then we have scripting methods, so you can add logging information through different methods that is provided by majorly Glide System API. So we have logs, info, debug, error, warn. Usually people don't know, but log cannot be used in your scoped application. So your gs.info, debug, error, and warn should be used in scoped application, while for the global application, all of them are applicable. And you can also add some debug logs with add info messages, so you can see those instantaneously on the form itself. Then for the scripting side, we have JavaScript Executor. It's a really good tool when you start debugging your client side code. Instead of using like thousands of alert statements, you can simply write your code in this window and just click on run my code, and it would instantaneously execute your code in the same window. You can open this by Control Alt Shift J. It's a bit of a long shortcut to say, but that is it. Then we have field watchers where you can select a field. You need to have be on the home page window. By that I mean you can see application filter on the left. So that would be the home page of ServiceNow. You can open any form, right click on the field, click select watch, and there would be a pop-up from there would be a window from the below where you can see all the debug logs, like which is the UI policy that is running and other things. So it's really good to have some client-side debugging if you want to do. Then JavaScript. So JavaScript, we are majorly writing code in JavaScript on ServiceNow, and it has really some weird parts to it. So first, how can you access object properties? So object plays a major role when you write code in JavaScript, and there are multiple ways to access the properties that are there on an object. So you can simply dot walk it, which is the major way usually we use in our scripts. Then the second is using bracket and provide the name of the property as string. And the third would be adding the brackets to the object and then providing a variable that contains the name of the property. But the weird thing would be if you directly add a property or directly try to access a property that is not in terms of valid variable rules for JavaScript, then it's going to throw error. But if you write that same property name as string, it's going to work perfectly fine. So this is one thing that you need to take care of, and the easy way out would be stick to the good naming variable convention, same as for the property, and add the property name as a very as you would add as a very valid variable. Then truthy and falsy values. So when it comes to JavaScript and its various ways where you can use conditional statements, a conditional statement would either execute when some value is true or do some action when a value is false. So these are the values, or these are the things that are considered as false in JavaScript. So a boolean false would be false, a null would be false, unidentified zero, an empty string, or an unidentified property on an object would be considered as false. For truthy values, everything that is not on the list is truthy value. Then coercion. This this is a fancy term simply just to identify that your JavaScript converts the data type in two ways. Either it would be explicitly or implicitly. Explicitly, if you look at the right hand at the top, so when you make a conversion of data type, so let's say you have 2 as an integer and you convert it by intentionally to a boolean, then it's an explicit conversion. While if you write some code and JavaScript is automatically converting it for you without you knowing, or maybe you write in a way that it should convert, then it's called implicit conversion. So what's the effect of this in terms of your code, and why do you need to know about this for best practices? So let's say you write a code and you think that it's really correct code, but for some reason it's showing some bug. So one of the major reasons of that can be coercion. We usually use ifs in our code, and we simply use double equal to. What double equal to does is, if you have one operand as string, then it's going to perform some kind of a coercion where it converts your data value. While if you are using triple equal to, it's not going to convert your both the operands, whether it's LHS or RHS, um, to different data type. It's going to compare with the data types. So some of the examples, if you can see the code from line 41, if you add a numeral 2 it would be considered as true because it's converted to uh, a truthy value. Then same goes for other examples. The edge case that you need to think about this is null, where null is equal to null, but null is not equal to undefined. So usually what we do is when you write a code and we assume that if we get empty value or something like null or unidentified, undefined, then we compare it with double equal to while they are not equal. So that can break your code. And the edge case would be nan. So let's say when you did some conversion and you get a nan and you're trying to compare two nans, they are never going to be equal. Nan is not even equal to itself. So that's how bad nan is. Then primitive conversion. So this is how you can see that when we try to convert different type of data values uh, to a primitive value. So in the first case, you see that if we try to convert null identified true to a string, then what's the output they would have? Same goes for boolean and numbers. So this is how you know that if you are having some kind of a bug where you can't understand that why it's happening and you are using double equal to, then coercion would be the reason majorly for it. And this table can help you to identify that why that error is in there. And then some what examples. It's really famous thing for not service now, JavaScript, that it does really weird behavior when it comes to coercion. Like in the first example of code, if you add true plus false, it gives you 1. If you divide 12 by a string 6, it gives you 12. Why it's happening? It should not be behaving that way, but that's how it is. So by knowing these examples, it can really help you to understand and implement your code so that you are not getting any bugs out of surprises. Uh, there are not a lot of edge cases related to this, but yes, there are. And for each and every case, if you want to know about this in details, we have added some links, and these links would be provided in the description of the video once it's posted on YouTube. Then code optimization. So let's say you know all the best practices and everything, and you start implementing. But how can you improve your code as a whole, as a team? So there are different ways where you can write code which can optimize and help you understand better and improve the overall performance of your instance. Like when we start writing a code and there are different conditions, one of the favorite conditional statement is if. You can write like 1,000 if and else statements, and you can create a maze for other developers. They get lost for like hours to just to understand that what they are simply doing. And the easy way is you can start thinking about where you can use switch instead of if. So if you are using same condition or similar type of condition, like in our case, if we are testing for different states with different if statement, we can use switch instead of if. It would be really clean, easy to understand, easy to update and maintain. Same goes for ternary operators. So let's say you have to write a simple condition where if something is true, then return this or do this. If something is false, do this. So instead of writing a long bit of code, you can simply use ternary operator for simple operations like this, where if your condition is true, then return the first value. If it's false, return the second value. This makes it really clean, easier to maintain, and really helps your developer to understand that what's happening instead of just going through a lot of code. Then unused declared variables. So let's say you have started writing a code, and over the time it's really long code, some pieces were added, some pieces were removed, but the variables of values that were declared, they remain the same. So later on, let's say if I come back to this code which has already been being maintained and updated a lot of time, there are so many variables that I don't know that what is being used or not, and it can really confuse me as a developer who needs to maybe maintain this code or maybe debug this code, that why this variable is being used, whether this is the thing that's introducing bug. Maybe you have defined a same variable in multiple places, so it's overwriting each other. So if you have multiple variables, then remove them. It simply creates a bit of a overhead, which can also impact your performance a little by little, as these things may be small but add up to a lot over a time. Then objects versus one to many variables. So as I mentioned earlier, when it gets a bit longer code, or maybe the functionality is complex, or you are using a lot of variables, sometimes those variables can be one to many. So instead, start using objects. Using objects can help you to have a cleaner approach towards how you're defining your values. So if you compare your first piece of code and second piece of code, you can see that whoever comes and look at this code, he can clearly see that yes, these are the states and these are all the values for the states. So if you have to maintain, or maybe you have changed the values of states, it's easier to simply change those values instead of just going through those list of variables and first trying to understand and maybe introducing a new bug for yourself. So rewinding all the things, avoid being writing a lazy code, avoid being lazy when you write a code. Give extra time to those variables, naming those functions, avoiding those blank spaces, those extra blank spaces, adding extra time to just write those comments so that the next developer who works on your code doesn't need to invest a lot of time just to understand what you were trying to do. Kicking the can methodology. If you write a code, own it. Don't just write a code simply terms of yes, you have some deadlines. Yes, you need to push this code as soon as possible, but don't just write a low quality of code just for these conditions. When you're writing a code, have a mindset of writing a good piece of code, have a standard, have a good practice about it. Then start building some standards and building some coding habits. So once you have starting implementing your standards across scriptings, have your team to work around those. Have your team talk about that. Once you start writing a code, have a habit about that you don't have to go through the standards again and again. You have just starting you and implementing your code in those standards. It should come natural to you. Then do peer review and code refactoring. So once you start doing peer review, you become a more bit intelligent about what you are writing, how you are writing, or maybe your team have interactions about that, had discussions about that, so that they have a better understanding of how well they can develop some standards and implement those when they are writing the code. Then whenever you're writing a code, and the best place for this would be script includes, try to have a mindset that how I can write a code that can be reusable. So I've seen that, let's say someone writes a code in script include, and there are like 10 or 15 places where I can see that they are again writing gr equals to new glide record again and again. So that's a rework. So avoid that. Have a reusable code mentality when you are writing a code. Write a piece of code and reuse it again. That's going to save you time and help you reduce bugs. Then try to use the tools that are available for your disposable, whether it's in ServiceNow, which we have discussed, or whether it's outside ServiceNow. Like one of my favorites is VS Code. Yeah, it can really elevate your performance when you start writing code on that. Then small inefficient code can have a big impact as they grow. As we mentioned and looked earlier, that yes, you write bad code, you don't have standards, although it's working, but when you start working on things for a longer term, they add up. They can cause a performance impact on your system. Your form's going to load up slowly. Then there's a lot of things to learn, and you can learn from ServiceNow itself. There is a lot of out-of-box code which you can go through and adopt some best practices from there. So this was it, and the QA section where you can ask all your questions.
Thank you, Sagar. Thank you for providing the details about the webinar. So, Sagar, we have few questions. So, starting one question is, what are other coding best practices which we can adopt?
So there are multiple, excuse me. So there are multiple best practices that you can adopt. Like Google have some best practices, Airbnb have some really good best practices that they usually use. You can go through their GitHub repositories; they have them there. But if you are starting implementing your best practice from the scratch, I'll suggest Idiomatic JS is one of the good things. You can go at their GitHub page. They have listed out all the best practices they use while writing the code. Next,
Thank you, Sagar.
yeah.
Next question for you we have, how do we implement these practices to our existing code base?
So if you have a really large code base already, I won't suggest that you start uh, editing your code again and again just to implement these best practices, because it's going to take a lot of time. Instead, whatever new code that you are writing, start implementing your new best practices in that. And if you are touching any older code, then invest some extra time to refactor that entire code and implement your new standards in there.
Okay, thank you. Uh, I think these were two questions which were asked in today's webinar. I would say thank you everyone for joining today's webinar. If you have any questions, please feel free to email us at sales@closing.com. I'd like to thanks once again, Sagar, and thanks everyone again. See you next month for our next closing webinar. Have a good day.
Thanks, Varsha. Thanks, everyone. Have a nice day ahead.